Dude, this is freaking me out. Whatever I saw on that screen, it wasn't from a station. Then he would whisper, "See you soon." Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sydney, and if you are new here, this is just a place where we can talk about true crime, spooky, scary stories, dark history, or whatever else I got going on in my brain. So it's been a while since we had a creepypasta and White Claws, so I thought that it is time for our second installment of this series. So if you haven't seen the first installment, it's not important, but if you enjoyed this one, I do recommend you go watch that one. When I was younger, I found that my favorite kinds of creepypastas were the ones that surrounded things that were very familiar to me, but put a little twist on it. So today we're going to be looking at 4 creepypastas from around the internet that include kids' TV shows. So, without further ado, I'm going to get into my, I thought it was lime. It's definitely pineapple, which is like the lowest tier of White Claw, I feel like, in my opinion, but it's not horrible. It could be worse. It could be worse. Definitely could be colder, but that's kind of how we roll. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get into our first story today, called Gurgles and Bugman. The picture is not a good sign. Like, I'm already scared, and I'm gonna scroll past it because I hate looking at that. Okay, so Gurgles and Bugman. When you're 5, your mind lacks the experience to make informed judgments or connects things which aren't obvious. Over the years, the details get fuzzy and forgotten. Speaking with my parents the other day, they cleared the cobwebs bearing this story. I remember now much too clearly the story of Gurgles and Bugman. I just started kindergarten that year. Everyone's a friend when you're 5, so I had no shortage of classmates. Coming from a poor family, I didn't get to see much of them outside of school. My parents spent all of their waking hours trying to make ends meet and didn't have time to ferry me from house to house. So I spent my early years mostly keeping to myself, playing with the random assortment of knickknacks from the shelf in my room. Being short of money gave my family a habit of hoarding, so they hated to throw anything out. One particular item on the shelf was a small old-fashioned TV set, a wooden veneer box about 2 feet wide by a foot tall. It had a curved glass screen that took up half the front panel. Beside the screen was a large chrome dial used to switch the channels. At the top sat an antenna formed by 2 terribly twisted wires. When my boredom made me turn it on, I'd usually just get static and snow that glowed black and white on the screen. I'd twist the heavy clicking dial, hoping to pick up some local broadcast. Mostly, it would just be some ghostly images and incoherent sound fragments. But one channel was always crystal clear. It was the Gurgles and Bugman show. Gurgles was a clown, but not a common one. He wore a thin black suit that draped his skinny, tall body with a matching tie and oversized novelty clown shoes to complete his distinctive outfit. His pupils were completely black, like polished ebony marbles, with no traces of white around them. Black face paint around those eyes and across his cheeks and mouth made him look like a manic, grinning skeleton. It was only the crazy crop of curly hair sprouting off the sides of his head that gave him a more human look. As much as Gurgles freaked me out, Bugman actually scared me more. He was short and round, like a hunchbacked dwarf, with a dark cape. He had prosthetics covering his eyes to make him look like a fly, and a mouth that was rotated 90 degrees and opened from side to side. The show itself was like candid camera, with pranks played on unsuspecting people. It would always start with Gurgles and Bugman hidden away at someone's home. Gurgles would face the camera, staring at you, his bony finger touching his lips. When the unsuspecting star of the show came into view, a laugh track would begin to play. You would see them go about their nightly routines, oblivious to the conspiracy that Gurgles and Bugman had us involved in. We'd see them making dinner, or on the lounge watching TV with their family, or quietly doing homework, then watch as Gurgles and Bugman stole their pen, or moved their glass, or made things disappear behind their backs. The camera angles would change as Gurgles and Bugman shifted their hiding place from the dark corners of a room to the cupboards, to the ceiling, or under the furniture, all while looking back at you and winking. And the closer they got, the louder and more laughter would come from the soundtrack. Eventually, when everyone went to sleep, a victim would be chosen for the prank. Waiting in the closet or under the bed, once their victim fell asleep, Bugman would crawl out and gently climb in beside them. His jaw would open sideways, and out would come a sharp straw that he'd stick into the person's neck. This always paralyzed their victim, because sometimes you could see them struggle if they woke up and saw Gurgles and Bugman on top of them. The laugh track would then be extra loud and uproarious those few times that the victims came awake. Gurgles would make faces at the camera while the audience laughed, and Bugman would use his straw to drink from the person's neck. When the victim stopped struggling after a few minutes, the laughter would turn to claps and cheering. With Bugman finished, Gurgles' face would fill the whole screen with his impossibly wide, sharp-toothed grin. Then he would whisper, "See you soon." The way those all-black eyes pierced the screen always gave me the chills. I hated the show, but would always be too afraid to go near the TV while it was running. One day, the mysterious TV disappeared from my room. My parents told my 5-year-old self that they sold it to pay some bills. I accepted it without question, and I was kind of glad that it was gone. But yesterday, when I asked them about the TV again, they exchanged nervous glances, then filled in some missing gaps from my childhood. Halfway through that year, Derek, which was a classmate I didn't know very well, had died in horrific circumstances. He was murdered in his bed with a stab wound to his neck. No evidence of a break-in was ever found, so his distraught parents were taken into custody as the primary suspects. They denied all allegations against them. At the time Mrs. Nolan, our teacher, told our class, I'd apparently explained to her that Derek couldn't be dead because I saw him and his family on the Gurgles and Bugman show the day before. When Mrs. Nolan mentioned to my parents what I had said, they immediately took the TV from my room, drove it to the junkyard, and burnt it to nothing but ashes and molten metal. That TV was in my room because it had always been broken. It was never plugged in the whole time it sat on my shelf. Whatever I saw on that screen, it wasn't from a station. So that is my story of Gurgles and Bugman, but I'm not sure if that's really the end though. After all, do Gurgles and Bugman still perform their nightly show for some unsuspecting viewer somewhere in this world? And if so, who will be their next star? That one was pretty good. I had not heard of that one, and I don't think it's very popular or famous, but I enjoyed it. It was very spooky ooky and a good way to start this video. So next we're going to be diving into Dead Bart, and I'm sure a lot of us have at least heard of this creepypasta, if not read it ourselves, but I actually have not gone through it and read it word for word, so I am excited to get into this next one. You know how Fox has a weird way of counting Simpsons episodes? They refuse to count a couple of them, making the amount of episodes inconsistent. The reason for this is a lost episode in season 1. Finding details about this missing episode is difficult. No one who was working on the show at that time likes to talk about it. From what has been pieced together, the lost episode was written entirely by Matt Groening. During the production of the first season, Matt started to act strangely. He was very quiet and seemed nervous and morbid. Mentioning this to anyone who was present results in them getting very angry and forbidding you to ever mention it to Matt. I first heard of it at an event where David Silverman was speaking. Someone in the crowd asked him about the episode, and Silverman simply left the stage, ending the presentation hours early. The episode's production number was G706, the title was Dead Bart. The episode labeled 7G06 Mooning Lisa was made later and given Dead Bart production code to hide the latter existence. In addition to getting angry, asking anyone who is on the show about this will cause them to do everything they can to stop you from directly communicating with Matt. At a fan event, I managed to follow him after he spoke to the crowd, and eventually had the chance to talk to him alone as he was leaving the building. He didn't seem upset that I had followed him. Probably expected a typical encounter with an obsessive fan. When I mentioned the lost episode, though, all color drained from his face and he started trembling. When I asked him if he could tell me any details, he sounded like he was on the verge of tears. He grabbed a piece of paper, wrote something on it, and handed it to me. He begged me to never mention the episode again. The piece of paper had a website address on it. I would rather not say what it was, for reasons you'll see in a second. I entered the address into my browser and came across a site that was completely black, except for a line of yellow text, a download link. I clicked on it, and a file started downloading. Once the file was downloaded, my computer went crazy. It was like the worst virus I'd ever seen. System restore didn't work, the entire computer had to be rebooted. Before doing this though, I copied the file onto a CD. I tried to open it on my now empty computer, and as I suspected, there was an episode of The Simpsons on it. The episode started off like any other episode, but it had very poor quality animation. If you've ever seen the original animation for Some Enchanted Evening, it was similar, but less stable. The first act was fairly normal, but the way that the characters acted were a little off. Homer seemed angrier, Marge seemed depressed, Lisa seemed anxious. Bart seemed to have a genuine anger and hatred for his parents. The episode was about the Simpsons going on a plane trip. Near the end of the first act, the plane was taking off. Bart was fooling around, as you would expect. However, as the plane was about 50 feet off the ground, Bart broke a window on the plane and was sucked out. At the beginning of the series, Matt had an idea that the animated style of the Simpsons world represented life, and that death turned things more realistic. This was used in this episode. The picture of Bart's corpse was barely recognizable. They took full advantage of it not having to move, and made an almost photorealistic drawing of his dead body. Act 1 ended with the shot of Bart's corpse, and when Act 2 started, Homer, Marge, and Lisa were sitting at their table, crying. The crying went on and on. It got more and more pained, and sounded more realistic. Better acting than you would think possible. The animation started to decay even more as they cried, and you could hear murmuring in the background. The characters could barely be made out. They were stretching and blurring. They looked like deformed shadows with random bright colors thrown on them. There were faces looking in the window, flashing in and out, so you never were sure what they really looked like. This crying went on for all of Act 2. Act 3 opened with the title card saying 1 year had passed. Homer, Marge, and Lisa were skeletally thin and still sitting at the table. There was no sign of Maggie or the pets. They decided to visit Bart's grave. Springfield was completely deserted, and as they walked to the cemetery, the houses became more and more decrepit. They all looked abandoned. When they got to the grave, Bart's body was just laying in front of his tombstone, looking just like it did at the end of Act 1. The family started crying again. Eventually they stopped and just stared at Bart's body. The camera zoomed in on Homer's face. According to summaries, Homer tells a joke at this part, but it isn't audible in the version I saw. You can't tell what he's saying. The view zoomed out as the episode came to a close. The tombstones in the background had the names of every Simpsons guest star on them, some that no one had heard of in 1989, some that haven't been on the show yet. For the guests who had died since, like Michael Jackson and George Harrison, the dates were when they would die. The credits were completely silent and seemed handwritten. The final image was the Simpson family on their couch, like in the intros, but all drawn in that hyper-realistic, lifeless style of Bart's corpse. A thought occurred to me after seeing the episode for the first time. You could try to use the tombstones to predict the deaths of the living Simpsons guest stars, but there's something odd about most of the ones who haven't died yet. All of their deaths are listed as the same date. I like that one. The ending was a little underwhelming, though. Like, I understand it's supposed to be like, I think like apocalyptic, like they all had the same death date, but to me, like, the concept of the episode is much more interesting than a future apocalypse is. Maybe that's just me, though. So our next creepypasta is called Tom and Jerry Lost Cartoon. The 13 Tom and Jerry shorts made by Czechoslovakian director Gene Deitch are infamous for their poor quality and rather disturbing nature, featuring badly done sound effects and animation, and having a more realistic feel to the violence. Some have speculated that Deitch didn't like the concept behind Tom and Jerry and was pressured into making them, and wanted to make the people who watched his take on it feel bad for liking the concept. What many people didn't know is that Deitch was originally signed on to make more than the 13 episodes the public has access to. Desperate to get out of his contract, Deitch made one more Tom and Jerry short that few have ever seen. The short was called Tom's Basement. It opened with Tom in a typical Tom and Jerry house. His owner was the fat, angry guy from the other Deitch shorts. Tom's owner seemed even angrier than his other appearances. The first scene is him stomping on Tom's tail in a very realistic and painful-looking way because Tom is sleeping by the basement door. The owner yells at Tom to never go down there. Tom is clearly terrified and runs away to the other room. Our view stays in the room by the basement door, and we see Jerry come out of a mouse hole. He looks truly grotesque, far more off-model than in the other Deitch shorts. He gets an evil look on his face and follows Tom into the next room. The next few minutes are fairly formulaic. Jerry repeatedly manages to trick Tom into chasing him to the basement door a few times, but each time the owner catches Tom and he inflicts a painful-looking injury on him, which stays with Tom even after the scene ends. After 3 beatings, Tom is bruised all over, bleeding in a few places, and limping on a broken leg. After this, Tom starts to literally beg Jerry not to bother him anymore. He's not really talking, but he's crying and mumbling, and you can tell just what he's doing by his body language. Jerry just laughs at him and pushes him back to the basement door. The owner catches Tom again and goes ballistic. The camera zooms in on his face. It changes color and distorts as he yells at Tom in a much louder voice than any other sound in the cartoon. I can't post much of what he said on here, but it's definitely vicious and furious. It seems like Jerry has finally decided to take pity on Tom, though. Jerry picks up a knife that was lying around and stabs the owner in the leg, quite graphically. Tom opens the basement door and they carry the owner's body downstairs. There are dozens of other bodies down there, decaying and showing signs of their violent deaths. Tom and Jerry shake hands, and it seems like they've triumphed over the serial killer. But Jerry gets an evil look on his face again, and Tom says in that ghostly, deep voice,
"Don't you believe it?"
Jerry stabs Tom, killing him, and throws his body onto the pile. The last shot is Jerry putting up a for sale sign on the yard of the house, laughing, clearly planning to do it again. Again, that was one that I have never heard of before. I like these because they're kind of a nice change of pace from like the normal creepypastas. They're like not too dark because it's a cartoon, but it's still creepy enough. So I like that one a lot, especially because for example, I watched a lot of The Simpsons as a kid. I watched a lot of Tom and Jerry as a kid. So I could definitely see these things being an episode that a creator made just because they're pissed or just because they're not feeling great mentally. All right, the last creepypasta we're going to be looking at today is Ed, Edd and Eddy Lost Episode. As you may know, the popular show Ed, Edd and Eddy has been running for a long time. However, between October 7th and 21st of 2003, Episode 34 was accidentally released 1 week before it was scheduled to. It was also known to some around the office the primary writer had been sick with the flu, and instead of going on to make episode 34, the show was supposed to replay episode 1. At 5 p.m. Eastern, people reported a very disturbing new episode premiering on Cartoon Network. Some children were unfortunate to see it. Apparently, the quality of this episode was mediocre when compared to the regular standards. Animation was choppy, sound was constricted and very muffled. Reports of a line running up and down the screen, similar to a crappy VHS tape, were received. Scenery was described as overwhelmingly dark and depressing, without changing props or other background objects. Stormy looking. Characters also behaved oddly. Instead of normal goofy hijinks-inspired personalities, viewers complained that they seemed extremely agitated, gratuitously hateful towards each other, and constantly about to begin sobbing after their lines. The protagonist also had a very bad lisp. No one knows why, but he spoke with a sexual tone that further bothered the viewers. I was one of those viewers. The episode began with Eddy walking down the street with Ed. I noticed that Ed was missing. There was an angular shot coming from within the two to show them walking towards the viewer. Eddy was wearing the angry look he does when something goes wrong. His eyes were red around the iris. Ed looked absolutely forlorn and practically dragged behind Eddy, tears in his eyes, which were both lazy and looking in opposite outward directions. Kevin, the series antagonist, was riding his bike opposite of Ed's, towards them. The shot became blurry and low moans were heard coming from Eddy before Kevin hit him, which never actually happened because the screen went black. The screen then snapped back and Kevin was again heading towards Eddy. The view was so blurry this time, all I could see was a green blob headed towards a yellow one. Again, the low moan, only this time it sounded like a microphone was broken and loud static came from it, greatly overshadowing the moan. Then a claymation sequence of Double D sleeping in Eddy's bed came up. Honestly, it may have just been the abruptness, but I jumped and shivered. Waking up and getting out of bed, he moved oddly around the circular room, the fast pitter-patter of footsteps being the only audio. The step sounds were very clear as I was shown a bird's eye view of him scampering around the room. There were no visible doors. Ed began screeching as he moved wildly around the cell of the room faster and faster until the screen began to blur again, the purple's room color swallowing a now orange blur. An extreme close-up of Eddy's front door sat in absolute silence for a maddeningly long time. At least 2 minutes of dead silence and a door. Next we see Jimmy and Sarah at a doctor of some sort, probably a dentist. Jimmy, obstructed in view by a hanging lamp, is crying loudly, with Sarah trying to comfort him in an unusually warm fashion. It hurts, Sarah. It hurts. Suddenly, the door of the room is smashed open by a new character, a dentist. His face wasn't shown because he was tall enough to be out of the shot. Sarah was escorted out of the room, and Jimmy was shown. His headgear was mangled, the front bent upwards, stretching his lips very high, tearing proportions. The front of his gums were trickling blood, and teeth were missing. The disturbing part was he had lost both arms and legs beforehand apparently, and sat a paraplegic. I almost cried as I came to the conclusion that the others had beaten him up and bent his headgear. The camera stayed on his mangled face for a few seconds, still as a picture, silent as ever. Commercials came on. Dude, this is freaking me out. I didn't actually watch a lot of Ed, and Eddy because my mom kind of she didn't hate Cartoon Network, but she was kind of all those things like Nick and Cartoon Network. She's like, "Rawr." But when I did watch Ed, and Eddy, it was kind of scary to me actually to begin with because the characters are kind of weird. So this is actually very spooky. Naz is reading a magazine on her couch. The quality is now perfect. Eddy is now alone without Ed. The quality declines worse than before and he is still walking, the sun now lightening the mood somewhat as he smiles and begins running. The door is shown again and we see through Eddy's eyes as he reaches out and opens it. His house is nice and bright, but a very badly played violin is blaring, the only audio in this scene as he makes his way through the house. Eddy opens the door to his room. Johnny is shown under Naz's couch cushions as he crawls out on all fours in a comedic way and pops up behind her, still oblivious. I laughed because someone forgot to draw his eyes and I thought of a mole. Suddenly, though, I stopped laughing as he started swallowing her head, still in a cartoonish fashion, of course, but this was different. He and she stayed like this until she started kicking and struggling. Johnny held her like this until she went limp. A zoom in on his face revealed extremely small human eyes. Double D was lying on Eddy's floor, no longer in claymation. The camera showed Eddy's house for the remainder of the episode, about 3 minutes, and the next program began on the spot. That was a good one to end on. I think that taking something so innocent like a kids' TV show and just mangling it and molding it into something so scary, it's always a good time. So, well guys, that is it for today's video. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and have a great day. Keep being the bad bitches that you are. Bye guys.